everyone, this is Ayushi Gupta. Welcome to the 15th episode of Microsoft Hour of Code brought to you by Millionlights. Millionlights is a TV channel dedicated to improving the skills of people in their employability. Now let me tell you a little more about the Microsoft Hour of Code. Microsoft Hour of Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to be discussing the latest Microsoft technology topics related to programming and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. I hope you have watched all our courses from basics of HTML5 and CSS3 to creating an application with HTML5. Now, as you know, we are learning Windows 8 application development with HTML5. This course is for people pursuing computer science. Those who are interested in application development and have some previous knowledge about HTML and CSS can join us as well. For those who joined us later, you can go and visit our website www.millionlights.org and get all the previous courses from there. As I told you that today we are going to learn Windows 8 application development with HTML5, and this is the third episode of this course. This course is basically for people pursuing computer science. These episodes have everything you need to upgrade your skills. This content has been created by our partner Microsoft. We have Jeremy Foster and Michael Palermo from Microsoft with us, who will help you to learn Windows 8 application development. In the previous episode, we covered HTML5 semantic structure as well as CSS selectors and style properties. In this episode, we will cover Module 3, which is Advanced Layout and Animation, in which we will learn positioning, display, and float. Now let's move forward towards the course. But before we start, you need to have all the tools that we have mentioned earlier. That is a 32-bit or a 64-bit computer system, a Windows notepad, and any web browser such as Internet Explorer. So let's get started with Module 3. Which is Advanced Layout and Animation.
We're going to continue. We've talked about selectors and combinators. So now we've described what it is that we want to affect. But there are a myriad of ways that we can affect that thing. There are. You want to give me a guess as to how many CSS properties exist?
I wouldn't even begin to know.
Wild guess. Wild guess. You've used most of them, but
yeah, thanks for putting me on the
there
spot.
There you
go. I can't even come up with a number.
Almost 300. Almost 300, and it depends because there's vendor-specific ones, and and there's unsupported ones, and. So it depends, but roughly 300 styles that can be applied to whatever you've selected with the techniques that I've just shown you. We're going to look at some of the color properties because those come into play a lot. We're going to look at some text properties, so some ways that you can manipulate your text to make it look like the font that you want or whatever. And then the all-important box properties. Pretty much everything on the screen is a box. You've got divs, you've got tables. Even your paragraphs have a box around them.
Sure.
So we're going to look at the box model and some properties that we can use to control how and where things show up on our screen.
Cool.
Remember that CSS is not just making things pretty by changing their style, it's also really affecting our layout. It's the language that tells our elements where they're supposed to go. So if you're working on an app and you have kind of a general section on the left and section on the right, it's the CSS that's going to describe that. That's what we're going to talk about in the either in the box properties or in the next module when we really dive into the layouts. All right, so the color properties. We used to be limited with the color properties that we specified a long time ago, like back when I was a kid, all we had was hex values. Now we've got, and there was really a recommended subset of colors that we were supposed to use because some people didn't have more than 16 colors on their computer or 256 colors. Those were the days.
Yeah.
Now everybody, you can assume, has the full color palette, and we've got multiple really powerful ways of describing color. And these show up in a lot of the different properties that I'm going to show you. You'll see them in changing the color of your text, in applying a border that's red, or in changing the background color of some div or the body or some element. So let's look at the different ways that we can change the color value. Let's jump back to that selectors demo on Code Show. And instead of all this fancy selector stuff, let's just apply this to the paragraph so that we can see that. And we used a named color here. But I'm going to show you that there are actually, I think there are a couple hundred, maybe 175 or so named colors that are specified in HTML. And some of them are real basic, like red or blue or green. We've got, all the basics. We've also got some esoteric ones like goldenrod. That's a named color, totally valid color. I think there's light rye and desert sun and all kinds of weird ones like that. But you can look those up and you can feel free to use them or not. Another way to specify a color is with its hex value. So this is the geeky way to apply your color. It always starts with a hash, which just makes you feel like a geek right off the bat. And then you specify 6 hex values. So anything from 0 to F, right? And it starts with zeros. There's 6 zeros, and that's black, so it looks black. And then there's also 6 Fs. That's white, so it looks like it disappeared because it's white. Now, I don't know if you know this, but these are actually 3 pairs, right? You can't specify them separately like that, but those are 3 pairs. And if each of these pairs are identical, like in this case, then you can specify your hex value with simply 3 letters, or 3 values. And it will assume that those are each repeated 2 times. Now, I have absolutely no reason in the world for that to be helpful. I have no idea why that's helpful, but now you know.
Save the typing for 3 characters.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, we don't want our keyboards to wear out.
Right.
So we could do something like 0, 0 for my red, 0, 0 for my green, and FF for my blue, and we've specified blue. Or we could shorten that to 0, 0, F, and now I've specified blue. Or 0, F, 0, now I've specified green. So we've got named colors, hex colors, but welcome to the modern era, we've got RGB colors. So obviously we're going to want to use something kind of powerful. We're going to want to specify any color in the rainbow. So we've got RGB, and this takes 3 RGB values between 0 and 255. So let's just use 0, 0, and 255 for blue, and let's make it green so that it changes. And there we go. We've made green. RGB is one valid function. We've also got RGBA. You ever use these?
I have, actually.
Yeah.
They're very cool.
With RGBA, it's expecting one more value, and that is the opacity. So although this one's green, it is 50% opaque, which means that it's 50% transparent. And so we can fade that out even more by going down to 0.2, and you can see that my color is green, but it's letting the background come through it. There's also HSL, and with HSL, we are specifying the hue, which is a number from 0 to 255, and then the saturation, so let's call this one 50% saturation, so we need that percent sign, and then the lightness, which is how much black value there is. So if we choose 0, which is red, then we can change the saturation and lightness to 50 and 50. And the nice thing about HSL is that as long as you keep this hue consistent, then you can just go change, for instance, the lightness, turn that down or up, and you've got values that are basically in the same spectrum. You're keeping the same color. You're just changing how light it is or how saturated it is.
Cool.
Yep, and there is an HSL-A as well, so you can add a 4th argument, and you can specify some opacity. Now, besides affecting the opacity through those functions, you can also affect the opacity directly with a different property. Opacity, and then something like 0.5. So now this doesn't have a color besides black, the default, but it does have an opacity, so it's turned it down to a 50% gray. And it's not just a 50% gray, it's actually letting the white background show through, and it's mixing it to what looks like 50% gray. So that's color and opacity. We're going to see those all over the place. Whenever you see that a property takes a color value, this is what you're going to rely on, is what you learned here in the color values. But let's look at some text properties and see what we can apply to our text properties. So we've got some basic things like text decoration that you can underline, overline, strike through. Let me ask you this, Mr. Michael Palermo. Have you ever used overline?
I have never used overline.
I haven't either. I guess you'd have to be like a math wizard, or you'd have to need to add bars above things to use overline.
Yeah.
I've never used it.
Never used it.
But underline and line through are definitely handy. Underline we use all the time. And you may know, by the way, that HTML is capable of specifying a U tag as opposed to this. Now, why would I use text decoration underline when that's so much longer than just saying adding a U tag around something?
That's a good question.
I think that the reason is, instead of having this extra tag in there, I mean, you're still going to have to wrap it with a span or something like that. You've done it in a standard way, just like you specify all your other styles. And so you can always go change it behind the scenes with your JavaScript. Yep. Okay, we've also got text transform. These are pretty basic, so I'm not going to show these right away. Text transform allows you to take whatever text you have described in there in whatever case it is and change the case of it. So if you want your menus to be all uppercase, regardless of the way that the developers type them into the HTML, you would do a text transform to uppercase. Then you're not dependent on making sure that it's entered correctly in the HTML. We've also got a text shadow, and I noticed this one's one of your favorites. Do you want to show what the text shadow does?
Yeah, actually, why don't you open up your the code show
Okay.
and go back to that CSS selectors
Okay,
screen.
got it.
So if you wanted to apply a text shadow to any one of those elements, you pick one that you
Okay,
think
let's
is
do it
good.
to the table.
So inside you would apply that text dash shadow, colon, and then it's going to ask for a series of arguments. You know, it's going to want to know in what direction is the shadow going.
Okay.
And so a positive number for the first would either be down, and then the next one would be over to the right. So why don't you put a simple one in there? Let's say 2px space 2px, and then the next value.
Whoa, I already see something happening.
Yes, you do. It's taking a default color at this time, which would be black, and it's applying that shadow right away.
But you're saying I can apply my own color.
You could right now, as a matter of fact.
And how do I know what I can type for color?
Well, what you just did it.
Anything I already did.
Just type in.
Let's do red.
Do red. So there you have your red. Now, what's awesome about text shadows is that you also have the ability to provide. Let's say you can keep the 2px and the 2px there, but right after the second 2px, why don't you add a third one, 2px? Now, what that does is it adds the blur factor. You know, to what degree do you want that blur to extend? So if you actually look down below, you could see it's got that nice little blur feature there. Oh yeah, so you can see it more. So you could increase maybe those text shadows to, let's say, 3 or 4px or so forth, and you'll start to see that the shadowing really takes place, and you get that nice blur. Now here's something that is also very cool that you can do. If you go after the gray that you have,
Okay.
and put a comma, now put 0 space 0 space and do, let's say, 10px. And do you see now what this did is it said we're not going necessarily in any one specific direction. We're going in every direction. And that's why you kind of get that glow effect. You still have the first one applied, that gray one, and now we've just extended that shadow to have yet another one which defaulted to black. So if you put in another color there, so you see how
multiple shadows.
Multiple shadows.
How many can I do?
You could do as many as you want.
Can I do 75?
I've never tried, but why not?
Nah, I don't think we should take the time to do that now.
No. And also another thing to note about text shadows is that if you do put any of those numbers in the negative, let's say you go to the first 4px and you make that a negative, and then you do the same thing with the second one, what you're doing is you're changing the direction of the shadow.
Gotcha. All right. Man, that's cool. Way more powerful than what we used to have, which is kind of the theme of HTML5, CSS3, and ECMAScript 5. They're exciting. Okay, so those were some text properties. Also related to text is fonts, and there are a lot of font properties. These are interesting. If you look at the last one, it says font shorthand property. And I haven't talked about shorthand properties yet, but a shorthand property is just a way of saving the developer some keyboard wear, right?
Sure.
So you could specify a lot of different properties, or you could just use the shorthand and specify multiple at a time, delimited by spaces. The font one is a little bit fickle. It actually wants style, variant, and or weight in some order, but they're also optional. And then you can specify size and line height with a slash in between them. And then you have to have font family. Okay, so it's a little bit picky as to the format that you put it in. So if you're going to specify them using the shorthand, you just need to know that. So let's go ahead and clear this and make everything in our table now let's set some of these individually. So the first one that we'll look at is this font style of italics, because that's a real common one. Font style italic. So now everything in my table is italicized. Not too difficult. I can change the variant to small caps. I'll skip that one in the interest of time. I can change the font weight, which is a very important one. And I can change this to, and again, my font one was not working for me earlier. I don't know what it is about my CSS. Let me just try this again. Let me try P, font, weight, bold. There we go. That's working. It was just acting goofy. Now, the bold one, by default, it's normal. But you can also say bold or bolder. And in this case, it's not recognizing that, which is fine. You can also say lighter. And now you can see that that font got a little bit lighter than normal. What you're really doing by specifying these shortcuts is specifying a font weight of anything from 100, which is the lightest, up to 900, which is the heaviest. And you can specify anything in between.
Cool.
So that's font weight. Font size and line height are pretty helpful. Font size is obviously going to be able to up the size of everything in there. Let's apply this just to the table. Yep, that works just fine. So that's a font size of 24 point. Now, we haven't looked at any length units yet, but you find length units all over the place. And it's really flexible as to what you put in there. I used points. I can also use pixels. I can also use 1 centimeter or, for instance, 0.5 inches. So there's a lot of different things that I could put in there for a length unit. But the line height actually allows you to do, so let's say, for instance, I had a font size of 24 pixels, and then I had a line height that was double that. So now I have double-spaced content. The font family, very interesting, because the font family requires that that font be available on the user agent's machine. Okay, so you can use a common one like Trebuchet MS, and then it's going to apply that Trebuchet MS, because you know that if you know that Trebuchet exists on the client's machine. But if you don't know if it exists, we've got some really great advent in the latest CSS3, and that is the ability to define font faces. Now, when you define a font face, you do it like this. We're not going to take the time to look at it in an example, but with a font face, you get to specify a URL for a font that's in your project or that exists somewhere accessible, and you give it a font family name. So in this case, I've found the actual file of nifty-n.woff, and I've given it the name of Nifty Font. And then later, I'm applying that to some element with the Nifty class, and I'm telling it I want to use the Nifty font. Now I'm basically delivering a font. Now, have you seen the .woff before?
I have.
Yeah. WOFF is a great format because you're able to actually specify OTF, open type font faces, TTF. Those can be used, but there's some issues with those. First of all, it's difficult to keep DRM on your fonts if your company has some proprietary fonts. It's difficult to keep DRM on those, whereas WOFF will allow you. It actually is a wrapper around those other typefaces, and it allows you to keep those secure so you keep your IP.
Cool.
Yeah, so that's the font face. Now, columns. Really important for text is columns, especially in Windows 8.
Oh, yeah.
In Windows 8, you may notice that we very rarely pan vertically. Really, most of the time we're panning horizontally, and we're on what we call rails. That means that we don't allow the user to accidentally bump the image up or down. It's locked horizontally. There's a number of reasons for that. The human arm actually moves side to side easier than it moves up and down. So this is a more natural movement. It's also the most common reading direction. And most of our displays, especially nowadays where we're at 16 by 9 most of the time, most of our displays have more room sideways. And it's also differentiating. It's just a Windows 8 character trait.
And I like the fact that you mentioned it was that natural arm movement because, I mean, we're getting into an age where a lot of the devices now are going to be touch screens. So we're going to want to apply that natural gesturing that people are going to want to do. And you think about reading a book, that's what you do.
That's
you turn
what
the
you
page
do.
like that.
Yep.
So I really appreciated that graphic that you had on your screen talking about the old and the new. And I guess the old on that screen refers to what?
Yeah, can we get that screen up again? The old is basically that's web pages, right? That's what we
Exactly.
see on web pages. The text, the column, that huge column is kind of monolithic. It's a little bit
Right.
intimidating. But look at the opportunity for a little bit of creativity and design when you lay it out horizontally.
Sure.
But that horizontal layout requires that we have the ability to specify columns, and we haven't until this point. So I'm going to move just a little bit quicker, but I'm going to definitely show you column support here. Sorry, there we go. So columns in Code Show, you can go look at this one yourself. There's a demo that's called CSS Columns right here. So I open CSS Columns, and you can see that we've got exactly columns specified here. So I'm going to jump to the source code for Code Show, and I'm going to go to the columns. It's actually called CSS Columns. I thought it's in the pages. Oh, I'm in the wrong source code.
Yeah.
That would do it. So we're going to go to CSS Columns, and let's just look at the CSS, the HTML you can imagine. It's pretty straightforward. Here, we are specifying one simple property, that we want the columns to be 400 pixels. Now, we could also specify an integer value to specify how many columns we want instead of specifying their width. So let me pump it up to 8 columns and then run Code Show. This is going to act differently now. Should run locally on my machine. Oh, it's running in the simulator, which is fine. And now you can see that we've got 8 columns instead of 4. And
Cool.
so we can use either integers or the width. All right, now the next thing that I want to show you is the box properties, the all-important box properties. We've got border, margin, and padding are fundamentally the box properties that we're interested in. But there are a lot of things that kind of center around that. And to show you the box properties, I'm going to jump back to our, where am I going here? I'm going to jump back to, actually I'm going to jump back to my Code Show project running not inside the simulator, but running on the local machine, because that's just a bit better experience. So let's run local machine, run that. Here we are, back and into the selectors. There we go. Now, we have a lot of text in this example, but remember that text boxes are divs and they're boxes. They've got 4 sides and 4 corners like any box you'd expect. So let's look at the lorem box here, and let's go ahead and color that so you can see what we're dealing with. Now, I'm going to specify a margin around that box, all the way around that box, of 20 pixels. And you can see that it's added some space around that box. Interesting. Now, I could add a padding instead of a margin, and it's going to basically look the same there because it's inside the div. It's a critical difference. And then I can add a border around that box, and for a border I have to specify not only a size, so let's say 2px, but also a style, because there's different kinds of properties that you can use. I could use, for instance, dotted, but I'm going to use solid, and then a color. So let's just leave that black. We'll just leave that off. But let's go ahead and look at red. There we go. Okay, so let's do black. So now I've got a border around that. Now, it's important to know how these 3 things relate to each other, and for that we have the box model. Every box on your screen, all your divs, paragraphs, tables, all these things have content, which is this middle section here. This is the content. And then they have the padding specifier, the border, and the margin. And then the offset is just if you offset it and put it somewhere on the screen, that's outside of the margin. So it's important to know the order of those 3 things, and the thing that's really important to know is that when you change the size of your box, that only affects, by default, only affects this content box. Okay? And you have to be explicit if you want that to affect the whole box. So let's look at that. If I want to change the width of this box, let's go ahead and keep that border on there, change the width to, say, 200 pixels. It's now made that box 200 pixels, but look what happens if I pump up my border to some ridiculously large value. Now, the content is still 200 pixels, but the border is in addition to that. Did you see that?
Yeah.
That's interesting. And a lot of times, that's not what you want. For instance, if you get a box in the mail from Amazon.com, or you're going to ship a box, and somebody asks you, what's the size of the box? You don't assume they mean the size of the contents inside the box. You assume they mean the size of the box.
Right.
So to change it to work like that, you can use box sizing and then you would use the border box. And now all of a sudden, it includes the size of the border, and it works more the way we would think. Okay?
Cool.
Now, the border, margin, and padding can be specified all together, or, sorry, you can specify them separately. So let's get these sizings out of here. And let's specify the border left. So I want the border left to be 20 pixels solid green. Now I have a solid green on the left. And if I wanted a little bit of padding to separate that from the contents, but I didn't want that padding to affect all the way around my box, I could use padding left of 20 pixels. And now I've got a little bit of space between my border and my line. And if I wanted a little bit of margin left of that, I could use margin left and just say I want 3 pixels there. Okay?
Cool.
So I've got a lot of control over all my spacing by doing it that way. We've also got the concept of sizing with the box model. You can change the width, change the height. You can also put prefixes on width and height and use min width, min dash width, and min dash height, or max. So you get a lot of control over how big things show up. And HTML does a lot of work for you trying to figure out the best size for things. And so if you use min width and min height, you can give it some parameters. You can give it some constraints. Yeah, I want you to go ahead and feel free to enlarge my text box, but I don't ever want it to get any smaller than, for instance, 80 pixels. So that's the sizing. Finally, we've got control over the visibility of all of these boxes on the screen. We've got display, which is going to control whether things appear or not, or how they actually behave when they appear. Visibility can hide things, but actually keep a placeholder for them. White space can determine how the white space inside of our div is treated. So if we, for instance, want to put some code in there, so when we say carriage return space, 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 we want that to matter, then we can turn on white space recognition as opposed to the default, which ignores it all. And also a really important concept in Windows 8 development is overflow, what to do with the text that falls out of our text box. And you can specify that you just want to chop it off by specifying hidden, or you want to automatically or manually scroll that content. And we use that a lot in Windows 8 development.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that visibility is controlled for us. Finally, we've got control over the box shadow, much like the text shadow that you were showing us. So we can add box shadows, and that's we've been doing all kinds of tricks to show box shadows in HTML for years. And same with rounded corners. Welcome to 2012. We've got rounded corners in our HTML. Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy.
Now, it might be important to note here that these sort of embellishments or adornments aren't specifically or generally encouraged in Windows 8 development.
Yes, that's right. In fact, with all the rounded features that some people were so after, and all the complexities with using images and all that stuff to make it work, you'll notice that in Windows 8, even in most of the screens, we have that nice crisp-looking box look, or tile look. So probably not a lot of use for it there.
Yeah, by all means, bring things into your app that make it look good, but don't always have a reason for it. Make sure that it's purposeful. That's the core concept. And then likewise, the gradients. Gradients are also, should be used with discretion, but you've got really good control over linear and radial gradients. So I remember using all kinds of tricks to do that as well. So we've seen a lot about CSS in a short amount of time, how to select just the right thing, a huge list of properties and what properties are available to us. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop those in the Q&A and somebody will get on those. But we're going to go ahead and take a break now, so we hope you'll join us afterwards. And we're looking forward to digging into more CSS in the area of advanced layout.
Yeah, this is fun. Thanks. So welcome back from the break. We just finished off with some CSS stuff, and now we want to get really specific about this next topic, which is going to really be focusing on how we can control where things go on our pages or our screens. And specifically, we're going to be looking at layout options as well as animations. And that's really the theme of this particular module. And in both of those, there's little side points. There's going to be layouts in terms of variations of what can be done with content. And with animations, we're going to talk about various ways that can be done, whether it's in a transition or whether it's truly just, let's just make something fly across the screen or do something crazy. So got a lot of jam-packed stuff on this one, kind of some eye candy, so we're looking forward to showing it to you. So
this is definitely a new world of web development with animations and transitions and
absolutely. Yeah, so even for those that are just purely web folks, this is also pretty exciting content if they haven't been doing it so already. So let's go ahead and consider now on our agenda where we're at. We're focusing on that advanced layout and animation, and we're specifically in here going to talk first. We decided to use the term legacy layouts because this was our way of saying we'd first like to introduce you to layouts that would still pretty much be universally acceptable or what would be done in a web browser. So
these still work?
Yeah, still works in the app land. So it's not like legacy means deprecated by any means.
Right.
We just use that word to say, here's kind of what maybe traditional could have been another word. So we don't want to confuse anyone by the term legacy. It just simply means that we're going to look at some ways that have been traditionally the ways that we have done some layouts. And so let's go ahead and talk about that right now. So the first thing to address is going to be positioning itself and actually using that within CSS. You mentioned in the previous module the display, but it can also be used to help out with some layout things in addition to some of the things that you had mentioned. Floating allows us to take content and actually kind of zoom it to one edge or the other of whatever container it's in. And that z-index is used for when we're going to start putting multiple things in kind of the same area and which one should be foremost in front and which one's going to be in the far background, and that could be helpful, especially when we're using what's called absolute positioning. So let's take a look at a little code sample right here on positioning. The very first item here is referencing the ID of an element. So we learned that in the last module where it says, okay, if we see that hash sign, then that means we're going to be identifying something. So whether it's a div or whatever the case is, we know it has an ID of ID01. Then we're specifying that it's absolute in position. A traditional way that when we don't supply any kind of positioning whatsoever, what the default behavior is going to be is however we're putting that markup on the page itself, it's just going to flow in that natural direction. So when we start to say, well, we're going to position it differently than that, such as an absolute, that's when these other properties start to make a lot more sense, such as top and left. Top means from the top of the container it's in, or in this case, maybe even from the screen, go down 25 pixels. And from the left side, go ahead and shoot across 50 pixels. And if we choose a z-index of 0, which is what it is by default, we're just saying, okay, and if anything happens to have a higher z-index, then the first one would be in the background. Now, the second one says position relative. A very subtle change here, but it could be very desirable to put something in a relative position. Typically, a reason why you would do that is you don't want, you actually kind of want to preserve where it was supposed to be in the original markup, and from that point, you want to start to move over, let's say, 25px or 50px, not necessarily from the absolute, top or left side, but relative to where it would have been, if that makes any sense. And then the z-index property here at 1 would mean that it would float over things potentially if it was moved across other content, and if it was at the default of z-index 0, well, then it would maintain that positioning. So this isn't, of course, all of the options with regard to position, but it's two that if you use wisely, then you could use them effectively to accomplish exact placement of things. I say use wisely because with layouts in Windows 8, there's a chance that our layouts can change. We were talking about how devices and things like that well, we could switch something around to a portrait view, or there's even other features that we'll learn about tomorrow where we can position things off and dock it to the side. So you got to be careful using absolute positioning because of that, because layouts can change, and you may have an undesired effect if you use these without some caution. So
Yeah.
I'll just put that little red flag out
Yeah.
there. So the other thing that you can do is use display. In the example that is now on the screen, the dot vanish, which would mean anything that has a class that equals that. If you say display equals none, well, then that means it's gone. It did vanish, as the name implies. And then to show another way that you can use the display, I found that even on the web, there are so many forums and so many things regarding how do I exactly center content within, let's say, a box. So again, this is under the context of we're in legacy or traditional mode, right? Because hint, hint, Jeremy is going to be talking about a cool way to do this using another methodology. But this would be a traditional or legacy approach to saying, okay, well, let me use this table cell as a display. And because of that, it enables something very important. And that is, a lot of us have probably used text align, which means let's go ahead and center the text. But that does that centering horizontally. But when you try to use a vertical align, it really doesn't take effect unless you're in a display that supports it, such as table cell. So many web developers have tried to use that vertical align on a div without changing that display, and wondered, well, what's the point of that thing? It doesn't seem to work.
Isn't vertical align supposed to vertically align?
Exactly. So and now, if you set your display, because we know that tables have that vertical alignment, so it now supports it when you say, hey, I want my table cell to have that vertical align. Now, another important thing about getting it centered just right is you had talked about in the previous module how you can apply these minimum heights and minimum widths. So you want to do that as well if you're going to use this little technique to center content, because if you don't do that, it's not going to take effect. It has to know what's my dimensions for sure, so I know how to center the content on the screen. Content could be something as simple as just text, whatever the case is in a box. So now I would like to demonstrate some of these layout features. And to do so, I'm going to switch over to a project that was open before, and now it's going to have some additions to it. So the first thing that I would like to do is look at this text. In fact, I'm going to go full screen and really make sure that we can see that. We have an SVG element that's been applied to this particular HTML. This is kind of a play off of what we did earlier. You can see down below here with the form that, this is where we had the kind of quiet clapping at that time. Finally got that fixed. But anyway, we have the SVG option here. And this is what it's going to do. Let me go ahead and run this first so we can see what it's going to do, and then we're going to see how we used all these legacy positioning techniques in order to make it work. So I'll run this, and what we have over here is, it looks like an image of, I don't know, what kind of phone does that kind of look like to you?
It's not, it looks a little bit like a no, I think it's a Windows phone.
It's a Windows phone. So I applied the SVG as recs that go on top of a container that has its background image set to a Windows phone.
So you're compositing or combining SVG with a regular old image. You're overlaying it.
That's correct. Now, that overlaying that you're referring to means I'm using these positioning techniques to put that SVG right on top of that item, so it has that effect that they're all combined.
I see.
I even have a hover in here. So remember, we talked about shadowing in the last one. So I can shadow, provide that glow around the entire thing once it's highlighted. And every time I hover over one of these little SVG recs, all I'm doing is setting that opacity that you were talking about earlier to something that would allow me to see through the solid color and see what was the, oh boy, shameless plug for myself there, but all the images and stuff that are underneath. So kind of, it could be used to actually create like a little menu that you want to have appear. And of course, with certain animations and things, we can have that thing slide in and slide out. But now I want to go back over to the code and discuss how did we make that possible so all this overlaying works. So that would all be in the CSS. And there is an options menu. You'll notice that I set its z-index position to a 2. I set its position to absolute. Set your top and left properties. And this is where I set that Windows 7 phone GIF. So, I don't want it repeating or anything, but let's go ahead and set that as the background image. Then I have an options SVG. I set that relative. And I have to do an offset here just based on some of the default marginings and paddings and so forth. I have an options text in there that refers to a little green text that was appearing at the top of the phone. And then if I hover over the SVG, then I get that box shadow effect. If I hover over any of the rects, I get the fill and the fill opacity features here. In this case, I chose, hey, fill it with a white color, but with that kind of opacity, you never even knew that there was a white color. It just became somewhat invisible. And that was basically how we were able to get this stuff positioned onto the screen. And it's also worthy to note that, you could bring in your other CSS3 properties here, like changing the pointer or something, so it has that clickable effect. So I'm going to go back over now to our presentation. And I think that this is an opportunity to provide this little segue, because you and I have had some chats about how things have been done, and we're now also interested in seeing what are some other cool ways of doing things. That centered box using that table cell, it kind of feels like a hack, because you're thinking, is it really a table cell? I'm kind of using that even though it's not inside of some table, or it could have been, but in that case it wasn't. It works, but it feels like we need to have a way to within our application, since, as you said, everything seems to be a box, and a lot of things you're going to want to have that control over the centering or what we're going to be doing. There's some new things out there that I think that we should be aware of. So at this point in the agenda, we're getting into 2 of those, and the first one here is Flexbox.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, like I said before, just because it compiles and passes the unit tests doesn't mean that it's well-written code. I think one of the big parts of well-written code is code that another developer can step in and understand what's going on relatively quickly. And if I have to try to translate and map table cell, oh, it's not actually a table cell, but that's just a trick to make it center correctly, then that's not going to be ideal. So we're talking about the difference between how you lay out code, say, between 2002 and 2012. So we've got some implements here that were introduced to us in CSS3 that are super, super exciting. There's a lot of buzz about these online because they are not just something that Microsoft is doing, but they're something that W3C is, there are submissions to W3C, and they're recognized as standards in W3C, and other browsers are recognizing the need for these and working on implementations as well. So we know that they're solving real problems. We know that they're alleviating real pains with developers, and so they're definitely worth looking at. The 2 that I'm going to highlight right now are the Flexbox and the Grid. And the reason why I'm going to highlight these 2 is because these are pure CSS, but we're going to look at some more layout techniques that you'll use specifically for making Windows 8 applications when we get into the tomorrow's session, when we get into more Windows 8 specific stuff. But what we're talking about now is just CSS, so this is going to work on the web. Okay. Now, since the standards aren't entirely complete in W3C, we still have vendor-specific prefixes. So you're going to see this -ms prefix before some of the things that we do here, and that just means that it's not entirely solidified yet, but as soon as it is, Microsoft is committed to using the standard selector values instead of the vendor-specific values.
That's good.
So let's look at the Flexbox first. What problem is this solving? The Flexbox is giving us control over its child elements. Now, if you've got the Code Show project running, you can follow along. I'm just going to switch over to Code Show, and I'm going to go back up to the index and look for the Flexbox example. Now, some of these examples, if you've got a touchscreen monitor, you can swipe, or if you've just got a mouse wheel, you can scroll. But again, welcome to 2012. More of us are getting touchscreen monitors, and we can just swipe from one example to the next. But I'm showing a few of the advantages of using a Flexbox here. Now, one of the huge advantages of a Flexbox is the fact that when you're laying out its child items, you can do so horizontally or vertically. And in fact, when you're horizontal, you can go from left to right or from right to left. And same with vertical, top to bottom or bottom to top. So they're really flexible as far as that's concerned. Perhaps that's where they got their name. This first example is showing you 3 child items inside of a Flexbox. The Flexbox is that gray outline that you see. And its child items are red, green, and blue. Just simple divs that have some size so we can actually see them. Now, let's go look at the code for this. And that's going to be found in the Flexbox project. There's an HTML, CSS, and we're not really using any JavaScript in this at all. So first I'm going to go to the HTML. I'm going to close down my other ones so we're not confused. And let's look at this first example. This is it right here. It's very simple. We have a div with an ID of Flexbox1, and it has 3 divs below it. So you can see the role of HTML here. It's just the structure, a Flexbox, and then 3 things underneath it. Just the structure. The rest of this is happening in the CSS. So let's go to flexbox.css, and you can see that these are organized in sections because remember this example has multiple sections in it. And the first section has this CSS. The first thing I want to bring to your attention is this use of namespacing. Notice that all of my CSS style attributes, style rules, begin with .flexbox.
Now, did you say the word namespacing? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, namespacing in CSS is an interesting concept, right? So the namespacing that I'm talking about is the fact that we're working in a project. Let's go back to selector. We're working in a project that although what we're looking at now is the Flexbox, it is actually still inside of default.html. We're still inside that first page. We're implementing a single page application here.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So let me see. Let me get my bearings straight on this. What we're saying is that we've only been in one page, even though there's all sorts of pages in CodeShow.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And each of those pages is dynamically swapped out into a content host because CodeShow is based on the navigation app template. And so those pages are dynamically loaded.
So when those pages are dynamically loaded and they have their associated CSS style rules with them, I think I'm starting to see what you're saying, why we need namespacing, because...
Because if we don't have a namespace on one of our CSS style rules, it's going to stick and it's going to affect the other pages.
And that may be exactly what you don't want to have happen. So unless you want it shared across the entire app, right, you probably do want it to be separated.
Yeah.
So show us that code again. That was interesting.
Yeah, actually on the HTML itself, you can see something interesting going on here. This page was created from the page control template, item template in Visual Studio. And so it automatically, you don't have to write this, but you automatically get these classes decorating this div that contains all of your code. So all of the pages have this fragment, and then this page specifically, since I called it Flexbox, has another class of Flexbox.
I see.
So that means that in my CSS, if I start my CSS style rule with the selector, with a class selector of Flexbox, then all of this rule is only ever going to define what's inside of this div. It will not pollute anything else. So that's important to note. We will, however, get way more in depth in the navigation app template tomorrow, and you'll see more about how that works. So don't be intimidated if it doesn't make sense quite yet. But we are namespacing these style rules, and in this case, since we have multiple sections on the page, we're even namespacing it not just to the page itself, but we're namespacing it to the section on the page by using an ID. And then we're specifying these divs, and I'm using this nth child 1, 2, and 3 to just say the first, second, and third div. I don't have to decorate those in my HTML with classes or IDs. I can just refer to them as first, second, and third. Now, the important thing to note here is this style rule right here. Implementing a Flexbox, I want you to be confident, is super, super simple. There's not a lot of stuff you have to do. All you have to do is change the display. This is the property that Michael and I were both telling you about. Has a lot of different values, and one of them is -ms-flexbox. So it's vendor specific for now, but in the future that would change to just Flexbox.
Sure.
Yeah. But for now, it's -ms-Flexbox, and that makes this Flexbox element, the one with the ID of Flexbox, let's go back to it, it makes that Flexbox element all of a sudden a Flexbox. Done.
Simple div now kind of turns into this Flexbox thing.
Yeah, it acts like a big control with all kinds of functionality, but all we did was really change its display value. Now, although that's all we did, I added some more attributes in here just to make it play kind of well. One of the things that we can specify is the packing. Now, the packing is the alignment of the child items along the axis of layout. So in this case, our axis of layout is horizontal. We're going from left to right because that's the default. And so our packing controls the spacing between our child items in that horizontal direction. So let's go look again at the effect.
Sure.
The effect is that we've got a horizontal box here, and its children are distributed equally in that space. Cool. Imagine for a second how you might try to do that in legacy layout.
That'd be tough. And so what you're saying is those three colors really represent those, I believe, 3 divs that were inside of that newly formed Flexbox.
Correct. Correct. Cool. Yep. Just that distribution would have, I think you would have to get into some math and do some JavaScript in order to lay out those.
And a lot of designers don't want to do math.
They don't want to do that.
No.
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 Okay, let's look at another feature of the Flexbox. We'll show you the effect first. There's the same Flexbox with the same 3 children, red, green, and blue. But now you'll notice they're actually filling that space. As opposed to just being distributed, they're filling it. In the Flexbox terms, that's called flexing.
Flexing.
Yeah, so just like a bodybuilder, we're able to flex and really show off some power here. So let's go to section 2 in the CSS. You can follow along if you've got CodeShow downloaded. We're still using a display of Flexbox, but I took the packing off because that's not necessary right now. And instead, not at the Flexbox layer, but down at the child layer, I'm specifying for the first 2 that I want them to have a -ms-flex value. Now, the -ms-flex value property takes 3 individual terms for its value. The first one specifies its relative amount of flex.
Relative amount, boy, that was a mouthful.
Yeah, so we're into quantum physics now.
Okay.
It's actually quite simple. It means relative to all of the other children who are flexing, how much should you flex?
Hey, so the third one doesn't have a value.
It doesn't. It doesn't. So by default, it's not capable of flexing.
Oh.
Yeah. The first 2 are, but the second one is told it should be twice as big as the first one.
I see.
In other words, since these are relative, this is exactly the same as this.
Oh.
It can be really whatever values you want.
So you can really get complicated here if you wanted to.
They're proportional, exactly. Sure. The next value is the recommended size, and that means that you have the ability to suggest what size you want this element to be, but the Flexbox parent still has a little bit of control over what that size is going to be.
I see.
Okay?
Yep.
We'll skip the third for now and just go look at that effect again. The first and second items are flexing, but the second item is taking up twice as much space as the first one because it had a flex value of 2. Okay?
Cool. Yes.
So there's lots more properties on the Flexbox to look at. I mentioned that the packing is the alignment, the control of the alignment of the child items in your Flexbox along the axis of layout, horizontally in this case. The alignment of the Flexbox items is their alignment perpendicular to the direction of layout. So we could, if this Flexbox had some height, we could control the vertical alignment of these children by using the ms-flex-align property.
Cool.
Yeah. But let's look real quick at a third and very powerful feature of the Flexbox, and that is its ability to wrap. So the Flexbox is laying these things out horizontally, and when it gets to the end of your container, by default, it just runs over the end of your container, and you have to specify your overflow and determine what happens to stuff that overflows your container. But if you tell your Flexbox, I want you to wrap, let's go look at that code.
Sure.
The section 3 is the wrapping Flexbox. At the Flexbox level, now we not only set the display to -ms-flexbox, but we also set the flex wrap to wrap. And now it's going to wrap. It's easy as that. And just for fun, we're setting the 7th child here to red just to see that you can affect the individual items still. And so now we have a wrapping set of divs, the 7th of which is red.
Awesome.
And the last example just shows you how you can vertically lay those out. Now, in Code Show, we have lots of plans to add lots more examples into here so that you can see all the different things that a Flexbox can do. But for now, what you see is what you get. We've got a little bit of horizontal, a little bit of vertical. But I want to take you now to the grid. The grid is another one of these awesome CSS layout features, but very different from the Flexbox.
I hope this tutorial was helpful. In the next episode, we will cover Module 4, which is JavaScript code capabilities. Is your mind ringing with questions, queries, or doubts? Do you wish to learn more? Then visit our website, www.millionlights.org, and post your questions in our forums. We will be extremely happy to clear all your doubts. If you missed anything and want to rewatch it, you can download it from our website, or you can watch it online as well. You can also participate in our webinars, discussions with subject experts, as well as get Microsoft certification on various courses through our website. You can also find us on Facebook by the name Millionlights, as well as on Twitter. For more such interesting tutorials on coding, keep watching Microsoft Hour of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Thank you.